kind of a jumping off point. All of us are introducing ourselves in regard to what we've taught or teach, and word organization comes up often to the extent that we become, in some ways, in the eyes of others, the people who understand human behavior in organizations. But it's organizations, organizations, organizations. Well, to get us started on this conversation about co-starring role for practice with theory, I just happened to see this coming through. This is the latest Harvard Business Review. And I looked at it and it says, emerging from the crisis, you know, with big butterfly coming out, how to lead through uncertainty and strengthen your organization for the long haul. So I thought about that. And I actually skimmed through some of they have short articles around the crisis and getting through it. But I think what I like us to focus on as we think about the nature of practice in regard to theories is how to learn through the uncertainty and strengthen your practice for the long haul. Take out organization for a minute and put in practice, how to learn, and therefore lead through the uncertainty and strengthen your practice for the long haul. And what really caught me and wanted me to start with that is the long haul. But many things that I've learned from the time Peter Vail asked me to join him in thinking about practice over a year ago is that the long haul is what truly matters now that we're going through this COVID situation. The long haul is something that every organization certainly would aspire to as a collective of people. But in particular, as individuals, we need something that'll get us down through time ahead and essentially in the long haul. And to me, there's only two ways basically that we perform work in this world to get where we need to get. One is as employees and or providers of some kind of simple service. But the other that I think has more likelihood to get us and our students ahead through the uncertainty and prepare them for the long haul is that they have a set of mind that when they work, it's practice. Not all work for them is practice, but there's some work they do. Some work that seems the most like them, the most who they are in the world, that they can determine by themselves it has a practice nature to it. Now, Peter and I, and you'll hear it in a moment, think of practice with what he calls a big P, that every kind of person out there who wants to say they're in practice, they're a practitioner of something, has every right to say so. Of course, some need to have some certifications, some other externalities to kind of reinforce that. But in here, where it really matters, to get to the long haul, you've got to have this feeling that I have a practice that's getting me ahead. I'm a plumber, I'm a shoemaker, I'm a teacher, I'm a clergyman. I'm something that really I know is going to get me through these uncertain times and out there for the long haul. So that the reason we want a co-starring role for practice is that one of the things that probably bothered Peter from the time he and Ellen were at Harvard is that there was a great comfort among faculty, among us, in using theory, writing theory, teaching students how to learn theory. And that comfort has been reinforced over the decades more and more through the various ways that accreditation works, so that we become focused on the material, on the content, and on the job of delivering content in order to teach people how to learn that content. So it's always back to the content, always back to the main star of the business curriculum, theory. And we can get in and we should discuss and even debate this. On the other hand, to stretch the point, the very thing that's going to get people through uncertainty and out for the long haul is practice. The theory practice equation. It's practice. And if we were to be, in our minds, more appreciative of what each student represents in those chairs or on these screens as actual or potential practitioners, we might feel that we can elevate the experiences that they've had and are having and the sense they're making out of those experiences to the level of practice. So while we really want them to learn practice, we'd also like to learn from them what they learn about being in practice. And the more that we could learn from them what it's like to be in practice, the more likely we are to make theory a co-star, something where theory now becomes for them even more important than visiting on their way out to get their degree and get out to the real world. So before I turn, what I want to do is Peter would have loved to have been here when we came up with this idea. He loved it. He said, make sure I get in there through Zoom and I want to be part of this conversation. Well, Peter, I'm personally quite certain that he was one of the early statistics for the COVID-19 numbers in Minnesota, and around the time in March when we all became allowed to realize that we were in trouble, he passed away in a hospital from all the symptoms that now we know as the COVID symptoms. So that was a hard thing for him because he has been so motivated for so many months and years now about this message that I'm trying to impart to you now, that he wanted very much to be alive for April, May, June, and all the way out to this, because he had more he wanted us to say to him. And so I'm going to make it more of a conversation, because what Peter would do is he'd put out a few thoughts and then he'd pause and say, what do you think? Okay. Are you okay if I switch and start bringing Peter's voice in, or would anyone like to comment on what I've said so far? Okay. Let's hear Peter. So this is the podcast that we created starting actually last July, right after the OB conference, because Peter was no longer physically able to work on a manuscript, do any revising or any further writing. It was just too much for him. So I said, well, you can still speak well and think well. Let's learn how to do a podcast. So I started learning. So when you're going to hear this early episode, a little bit of this early episode, you're going to hear not great audio. It's not polished. By the time we get up to the ones that are being done now, they're more polished. I've learned a lot about editing and have some really good help from a young man named Anthony. But I thought I'd start us out on this one, because he would tell us a bit of what practice is. Now let me see if I made sure I set my screen so I can make sure the sound comes up. Steve, could you do that? Make sure I can share sound on the screen.
You should be able to, if you just share your screen, share whatever app you are trying to put forth.
Okay, it should play. Okay, good. Here we go. Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Piron. The nature of practice, upon which we offer a number of conjectures over the conversations which follow. So I hope this particular event will give you something to hold on to and apply it to your own experience as a practitioner or a teacher of practitioners. Welcome to episode 2. Maybe that asks us to explain a little bit more about thoughts on practice and what are we talking about here? Theories, hypotheses, propositions? What would we like people to understand?
We go round and round on this, and I think at one time or another we've entertained each of the words you just sketched, not theories. That we're not talking about a theory of practice. No, since the last time we've talked, another word has come into my mind that is frequently used in a lot of scientific writing, but also in general conversation. That is the word conjecture. And I think that word captures more accurately what we really have in mind here. They certainly are not hypotheses. They are not based on systematic research findings, although both of us have tons of informal research and experience to suggest these conjectures about practice, the nature of practice, which we call a capital P practice, just to remind us that we're not talking about anybody's specific practice. We're talking about practices in general. So I think I'd like to play around here with the word conjecture. That's what it feels like we're doing to me, and I hope it communicates that to our listeners.
As they hear us talk about the conjectures that we've codified so far, I will remind them often that we're more than willing to accept and listen to anyone's conjectures about the nature of practice as they're living it, as they've read about it, as they've
absolutely
because I think we're on the cusp of moving our attention not so much off organizational effectiveness per se, but to expand our attention to personal effectiveness with a specific focus on practice. Okay, if we're focusing on it, what is it? Why is it so important? What are we discovering so far? Conjecture. So let's do it. Let's share some conjectures. There is sort of a big conjecturing about the nature of practice upon which all the others seem to flow and rest. So could you remind us what that operational definition is?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I'd call it an operational definition, but it's our way of thinking about practice in general. It's sort of our point of departure. Yeah, as we worked it out, I asked the listeners' indulgence. I'm going to have to read this because I haven't memorized it. but it's the way of thinking about practice that we're starting from. So here it is: the conscious ability to produce fairly consistently intended results, and to do so across a range of circumstances, and to do so while growing and changing oneself to meet the changing circumstances in which one's practice exists. I would go on and emphasize, so that's the end of our definition or of our working way of thinking. The conscious ability to produce fairly consistently intended results, and to do so across a range of circumstances, and to do so while growing and changing oneself, that would be the practitioner, to meet the changing circumstances in which one's practice exists. And we have since, I think, agreed that the key thing here is the notion of conscious ability to produce. It's not just kind of random action taking. It isn't just sort of daily behavior, you might call it. It's the conscious ability fairly consistently to produce intended results. Practice is nothing if it isn't action to produce intended results. But I think we've thickened it a little bit with these additional adjectives, you might say.
Are we frozen? Did we get frozen? Dave might be.
It appears that Dave is frozen.
Yeah, Dave is frozen. So, Joe, would you take over the discussion, or Joan?
So I suspect that what Dave wanted to do next was to see if anyone had any reactions to that. So I'll just kind of throw it open to people.
Has there been thinking about practice with respect to that old concept of self-actualization?
Yeah, well, that's the growing and changing part of that definition that Peter just read, the self-actualization. And I was looking at the intended results part of that definition and thinking for myself, what are the intended results of my practice? I think I know some of that, but I don't know that I am conscious of all the intended results that I've been seeking myself. Anyone else?
For me, what isn't quite captured by the definition and the way it's been framed is, I think about practice as being some combination of what you are conscious of, and I would say conceptually, what do you think the world is like and how it works and how you move through it, and things that you're not even particularly conscious of, they're just in your fingers because you've learned to do things and you have some sense that they work, or you learn from when they're not working and you try to modify. Although if you're like me, you probably just do the same thing louder, which isn't very good practice. I mean, it's that funny combination of cognitive and in the body. And yes, intended results are certainly part of it, but then I think it's impossible to live without having intentions, even when you're not paying attention to them. So if we think about teaching, one of the big divides that I see is the divide between those whose intentions are to get students to behave differently in some kinds of circumstances, and those who want them to talk differently about ideas. Whether they would say it that way or not, I don't know. But if you look at the classroom practices of a very high proportion of people who teach, you can infer that what they really want is for students to use a certain vocabulary to talk about things. And they're not so much about the students doing things, because if you were, you would teach differently. You wouldn't be thinking that teaching is all blah, blah, blah. Teaching is getting students into situations where they have to do something and learn from whatever happens.
So I just got off the phone with Dave. He lost all power in his entire home.
Oh, God.
So, yeah.
Oh,
So,
We're soldiering on here.
yes, I told him he was thrilled to hear that. He has no idea what's going on, but he has nothing. So he said, if you can continue on the conversation, that would be fantastic.
Brandon, is it possible for him to get in on his phone?
You could call in.
I don't know. He didn't make it sound like he was going to end up doing that. I think he's trying to figure out what the deal is with power. He's probably got bigger things right now, trying to figure out what the situation is than jumping back on here, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah. So if you guys can carry on the conversation, I'm sure he'll call me with an update as he figures things out.
Brandon, could you just? I know that he has to deal with the power outages at his home, but if you could just text him that an option would be just to come on for a minute or two on his phone if he wanted to.
I will absolutely let him know that. Yes.
Yeah.
So, so what I'm hearing Alan say is, are we conscious of our intended consequences in the classroom, our practice in the classroom, and are they for transformation or memorization or something like that. Maybe I'm simplifying it too much.
When I think of the question of practice, I think of my teaching as my practice. And so I try to kind of see where I could go with that. And I know that some of teaching for me seemed, once I had organized myself well enough, that I just sort of showed up in the classroom and did my thing for a while. I suspect that that's true for many of you as well. And I never really reflected very much on what it was that I did as practice. It was kind of what my occupation was and how I could do that. And I remember only one more fact about this, which was when I started teaching, I had these really detailed lesson plans for what I was going to do in each class. And the lesson plans eventually got sort of transferred to handouts. And I would hand out a sheet, and it would be everything I would say in class would be from the sheet or on the sheet. But that was, I could do a lecture from a sheet of paper at that point. And I would then think about how I built in activities and exercises and discussions around what my quote organizing framework was, which was the handout I had just given out to the class. Alan, I see you shaking your head on this.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm trying to keep from jumping in and talking for an hour because this is very core to me. But what this has made me think about, years and years ago at Babson, I ran a seminar for faculty on teaching. A colleague had done it, and then I did it. And one of the things we would start with is thinking about what your goals are, and then comparing how you figure out whether the goals are being achieved. And do your evaluation methods match your intentions? And I still vividly remember a guy who was the best academic administrator I've ever seen. His name was Tom Moore. And Tom just taught a course once in a while to keep his hand in. He wasn't a PhD type academic. He was just an incredible administrator. And he was in shell shock. He said, I'm mortified when I compare what how I evaluate students with what I'm hoping they'll get. You know, there's a huge disconnect. And that's one place where the whole question of practice shows up. And then to make a gigantic leap, I've been at it a lot of years, and I still have to remind myself and relearn almost every semester that how I'm behaving in class is as much the message of the course as the content, because all our courses are about leadership and interpersonal behavior and all that stuff. And, you know, students are watching what we're doing and learning from it. That's where the classroom as organization came from, is realizing that what we used to do exercises and simulations, and that was just one step removed from the reality, which was there was real organizational life going on, and leadership and behavior and teamwork and then it mattered how you did it. So I'm going to stop this by saying one of the things that going online did for me is make me much freer to include me in the course, to talk more openly about what was in my head, about my life, about my big screw-ups. And
Why was that the case, Alan? And was it synchronous or asynchronous online classes?
Yes. I was doing, but we were doing blended. So we had a mix of discussion board using Blackboard, an improvised, improved version that we had developed. We did some live classes with WebEx or Zoom, hi back. And we also had face-to-face classes, so it was blended. But all that proved true across all the mediums. I mean, I couldn't turn it off once I learned yet. And part of why you have to do it online is otherwise students disengage. They're just watching a talking head going blah, 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 blah. And there's plenty of evidence that that doesn't work. There's low retention. People don't stick with it if they don't have to. And I've always thought if you want people to learn content, give them something that's been written. They can go over it a bunch of times. But why spend class time talking what they could read? I mean, it was the flipped classroom idea without knowing a name for it. Just give them something to read and do, and then spend all the time on that, not on you telling, except in little mini increments.
I'm going to jump back in because I can't believe it, but the power went out on my road, and we were downstairs screaming through one of those automatic ladies on the phone. You're like, tell us what your power is out, and I'm screaming profanity at the power company.
That always helps a lot, Dave.
to an actual computer.
Dave's practice of profanity, right?
That was nice profanity.
Hearing profanity, David, your profanity came through the computer very well.
Oh no, did I use those words? But anyway, I don't know how far you get into listening to Peter, but let me just show you what, just a moment, and then we go back to you learning something. I'll teach you something, and then we'll go back to you learning something. But I'm going to go through a share screen here. Because I've come back to this idea many times since Peter put it as the foundation of his thinking, and it looks like this. You heard him say it. Take a look at it in a minute.
So we've been discussing that, Dave.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so we've been sort of digging into that definition, and each of us picking out pieces that had meaning for us, and kind of deconstructing it, I guess, is what we've been doing.
And that's what I was hoping for, and I think that's what Peter was, because the various conjecturing that he referred to and go on until his last episode, which is number 17, was amplification on what your mind starts to show you when you start looking at a person as someone who's growing and changing oneself. And the key word there is oneself, to meet the changing circumstances in which one's practice exists. And I look at our mission, and I've never seen it otherwise, to prepare people who are inclined, with our help, to always growing and changing themselves, but have to understand, going back to Sarah's presentation, that they have an obligation to themselves first to be cognizant of the circumstances, of the systems in which their effort to achieve results brings them, and to be able to anticipate soon enough to possibly adapt. And if this was all done before the COVID hit, we'd still go, oh yeah, that's good. But now I have a feeling of we've absolutely got to prepare people in a way almost overnight that they understand what it's going to take them to get through the long haul on all this. And it's going to be trying stuff differently, doing differently, taking different actions, and learning as fast as possible. And it's sort of a PDA experimentation, whether they should change anything they're doing, and eventually change their minds. So back to you guys. I I'm delighted that you stuck with it, and I'll stick with it too, and we'll listen.
I would just say, as somebody who's a practicing Buddhist or practices Buddhism, I think for me, the word practice it evokes a lot of what you've just described, Dave, and what the definition that you put up refers to, but the ability to be present with what is, as opposed to be feel hostage to the narratives that kind of float into us or are imposed on us by teachers, to Alan's point, or by theories or circumstances or systems. Though to be able to actually be with what is requires a kind of discipline over your mind. So there's a part of a part of an emphasis on oneself, but it also requires, as you just said, I think, paying attention to everything else.
Yeah.
And recognizing that if we pay attention to what is, it's never just us. It's always us with, or us as part of, or us embedded in. And so I think my experience, just the practice of teaching in a business school, and I've been trying to write about this, but that we tend to teach, I use the shorthand of drones versus decision makers. We tend to teach often in a very instrumental way, and I think to undermine students' sense of their own capacity to be with what's going on. And then we kind of make them dependent on formulas, recipes, theories that then, in the absence of one which meets the current circumstances, they're lost. And so, when we think about strategy, we think about being able to meet current circumstances. But a lot of the thinkers, I think, in our classes have been discouraged from seeing themselves as capable of doing that. And sometimes I think our educational system compounds that. So those are a lot of thoughts. Thank you so much.
Very valuable thoughts. And again, I get that stirring of, God damn it, we got to get out there and try to change this. Something has to change in the systems that we create in the universities, in our classrooms, because time is running out. It's not only running out on the planet and all the other feelings that you're getting these days of urgency for change, but we can't keep sending people out through our business school portals to the world simply dependent on someone else's thinking.
Here's the bad news, or good news.
Okay, I want both.
I think the market for business school graduates is going to, in the longer term, take care of it, because a lot of organizations are saying, I don't want to hire MBAs. They can't do anything. They're full of themselves. They're very expensive, and it takes them a long time to be ready to actually contribute. And the virus has just made vivid some of that, because the price of the degree gets clarified when you're not there in person and people aren't getting what they thought they were paying for. And they're even less likely to learn to do when you still have a lot of faculty doing online education by talking.
Yeah. Peter would have been chuckling right now. Right on, Alan, because he really had this point of view. I think with you, Alan, was it that he wrote, or someone, he wrote something about the minute MBA, or there was something he put a chapter in, and he said in that also, even back in the managing as performing art, that we should be preparing people to care about organizations and run businesses. I mean, they have to be able to do something, and I think that was part of what made this practice issue so important to him, because he was concerned that we were not producing people who had the confidence to go out there and do and learn while they're doing it. So anyway, more thoughts. the police may come any minute to get me for swearing at the power company. So we got to keep this moving right along.
So Joe said something about his practice is teaching or teaching, and I've been toying with this idea of my life, and I think Sarah talking about the Zen or about the Buddhist practice, but I'm toying with this idea now that I'm retired and I'm not, my career isn't necessarily the focus of my life any longer, and I'm not sure what is yet,
Yeah.
but my life as my practice. And so, so my practice was for 30 years was, and maybe longer through all my education, was towards this idea of what my vocation, my practice was my vocation, or my vocation was my practice.
Mm-hmm.
Now that I'm retired, I'm starting to see that my practice is actually much more than my vocation. It's my whole life. And then how do I continue to live my life in the time of COVID and also continue my practice? So one of the things I did, I didn't even know that this is what I was doing, is I went on Canvas and I went to my last 3 years of classes, and I offered all the students the opportunity for me to help to coach them, personally coach them, and whatever was going on with them, and I just be there for them, and they could call me or set up an appointment with me anytime. We could either do a Zoom or a phone call, and I just listen and kind of give input and help them through whatever they're going through. And it's really been fulfilling for me. And I've reconnected with some of my favorite students of the last 3 years. So I'm actually thinking of going back to all my Canvas classes for the last 6 or 7 years and offering the same thing, because I still have all those Canvas and I still have all those people's emails. And so I was thinking, that's the way I can keep my practice going, and during the time of COVID.
It's beautiful. And it's interesting because we worked pretty hard on getting our recordings going, but Peter was starting to, more things were happening to him physically. And so I said, well, Peter, why don't we start interspersing in our episodes some conversations with practitioners? And I have a bunch of really great kids who were my students and they're now out in the world. Let's pick a few and talk with them. And you'll see those in the podcast series. And to Kathy's point, it was a delight for Peter to actually hear these people talking about how their lives were changing. For the first one we did, just to be real quick about it, Christina, she had been a 25-year employee of Aetna Health and gone through all the changes. She's 25 years because she started as a freshman and as a receptionist there, became quite well developed in all of her Aetna life. And then suddenly Aetna was acquired by CVS, and she was gave a year of redundancy and transition. But she wasn't moaning and weeping about it. She had enormous courage, and she put herself out there to be acquired, have her time, her practice acquired, shared, because she owned it. But she's with another Fortune 5 company here in the area, doing somewhat the same things but differently. But when Peter, at the end of it, he said, God, she's got that spirit, you know? And he said, do you remember my book I wrote on spirit? But you hear it when you go back to these former students of ours, and I hope you all have the occasion, and you hear them say, yeah, I had struggled, I had to kick myself around a corner or two, but I'm still at it. I've still got more to learn. And so in a way, we must have been doing something right in our classrooms, not just mine. So other thoughts? I can give you a little more Peter Vale time if you'd like in a few minutes, but I'd like more thoughts. Practice, the nature of practice. Are we teaching to it? How can our society do even more to prepare people to respect their practice learning?
I have a question. I see all of our thinking situated in our lifetimes and in our youth. And I'm wondering if the youth of today are as receptive to the same ideas. I have an image in my head that I can't remember where I got it, of a recent image that purported to describe, think of, and he was this kid walking out and just basically forgetting it. Didn't give a damn about it, just something he had to do. And that he envisioned his life was totally different from what went on in the classroom.
Wow.
So I'm wondering whether, to what extent, I mean, one would assume that all of humanity has similar predilections toward the younger generation. Thinks about this, and I would also comment that if they're not thinking about it, that's too bad.
What do you guys think about that?
I missed, you cut out for a minute. I missed what the it was, Ray.
The it practice. The it.
You said a student was walked out and they completely forgot about or weren't paying attention.
They didn't. The class, they didn't see the classroom as influencing their lives. Their lives were so different from what was going on in the classroom that it was not that relevant to who they are.
I definitely agree with that. I mean, I've often talked about there being, I thought, like the Great Wall of China. There was what went on inside their classroom, and then their lives. And I think one of the things that distinguishes sometimes the more sort of excited student is the sense that there isn't a wall, that what happens, that the ideas and the books and the history and the conversations and are reflective of and can be integrated into their lives. And, you know, I was an undergraduate at Harvard. I didn't know that it was even possible to major in business until I started studying business as an undergraduate. But a lot of us have thought about the difference between a good liberal arts education and the curriculum in an undergraduate business degree. And I think, again, I have this really profound sense that undergraduate business education, which is what I do, really is designed to create a wall. It builds a wall, and it fortifies a wall, and it strengthens that kind of sense that what happens in the classroom, what happens in the books, is not really relevant, and what matters is the credential, and what matters is the salary and the title and the outcome. So I definitely think I would just reinforce what you're saying.
It's been true for a long time also. I don't think it's just the current generation. I mean, it was true when I started teaching a little over 50 years ago, that a lot of education sends exactly opposite messages from the ones that I think all of us roughly subscribe to. Compartmentalize, stay in control, manipulate the world around you, including the other people, and don't let anything touch you at school.
Interesting how that could be carried out into their work lives then, you know.
That's right.
Particularly if they have a status that allows them to rise above or stay away from those who are actually producing the goods and services that pay the bills. Yep. That would be horrifying to me. I think it's accurate. And yeah. I consider that one of the core things that I've been doing all these years is trying to get students to go past that, to not be enamored of all those things, although there's nothing wrong with a career and money and so all that stuff. But you can do it in a way that grows you as a person, or you could do it in a way that shrinks you. Yeah.
And so I need to say one other thing.
Okay.
I think in business school there is a pretty good size subset of faculty who try to live their lives exactly as you were describing, Ray. It's detached and in control and all that stuff. It starts with the finance and economics faculty, and then the quantitative faculty get into it and so on. But I've also seen that people in organizational behavior often divide between those who are about control and managing student deviance and keeping things from getting beyond what they feel comfortable with, and not letting things go where they don't know the answer themselves. And then the faculty who are willing to try to walk themselves out towards the edge of being alive to what's going on, and managing that combination of paying attention to the environment and paying attention to yourself. Really hard to do both. But we're working against deeply embedded cultures.
Yeah.
Deeply embedded. So it's no surprise that that's what students walk away with.
Yeah. This.
And I'll add one more thing in.
Go ahead, Al.
Accidentally and fortuitously, I'm now the grandparent of twin 7-year-olds. So I am deeply amused and engaged in learning from, seeing them learning. They don't have any of this stuff at all. I mean, this period of learning at home and online, they've loved. They just worked at their own pace. They learned, can read at different rates. One's a girl, one's a boy, very different capacities around language stuff right now anyway. And they are so excited about learning everything. And they don't differentiate between school and not school. It's all just one big opportunity to learn stuff.
Wow.
And they like the experiential learning best, which works well because their mother never could learn any other way. She's a single mother. And it's depressing because there's pretty good data that around 4th grade, all schools take it out of kids. Turn them off to education and to separate things. And that's really depressing. Yeah. So by the time we see the kids in college, they're already way over socialized to the wrong things about education and self and learning and all that. We have a big job up in front of us.
So what are, yeah, other thoughts, please. These are good thinking, and we're driving at what we might at least be able to pass on to new faculty like Chantal and Brittany and some of the others who have quite a long haul ahead of them. Speaking of long haul, and it's your practices as well as ours that are going to be hitting these different huge challenges. And by the time you're at our stage of career, we'd love to have you doing something like this, saying, we figured it out. We broke through. We've got this balance now that Farron and Vail talked about. And if anything, practice has taken a higher status in our work, in our thing, because the students insist on it. They insist on knowing what can they do with this stuff. And then we help them figure that out. And then our stuff gets a better, it gets remembered beyond as Ray's proverbial door. They really have integrated that stuff. So back, Chantal, what are your thoughts? I'm preaching to you or Brittany. What are your concerns going forward?
I'm gonna say those are pretty high expectations.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I really resonated with I forgot who said it, but like, the mindfulness aspect of practice and the being here. And I was thinking about it here kind of in our virtual conference, but also with our students kind of doing that virtually. I find it so much harder than in person, right? Like being mindful at MOBTS when we're in person is a lot easier than being mindful here. I'm on the computer and my email pops up and I'm like, oh, I'm just going to answer that real quickly. And right. Whereas at MOBTS, I put my phone away. I don't have my laptop out. And it just so I guess that's the practice part that's kind of rolling around in my head. How do we continue that practice, especially the practice of mindfulness, when we are online in our own spaces that's so easily distracted, even for someone who's actively trying, yet alone for students who may or may not be?
Well, we talked about context. I'm not sure why I'm getting feedback now, but we talked about in the last part, the context in which one practice exists. So this is the context you are in, or those of you who are still actively teaching. And you're now sizing up the pros and cons of it. And when you get to that goal of this definition, though, that they need to be conscious of their ability to achieve results in a fairly consistent way. That kind of consciousness is, as Peter once said in one of our projects, it's a set of mind. They have to set their mind to wanting to make this somewhat a definition of their life. Back to Kathy's point. I know that's a high expectation, but I had a carpenter here working on some out on the back of our house, just socially distanced, but he did such a magnificent job of transforming a screen porch into a sunroom that I didn't mind paying him, and it was a lot of money. But you watch someone who's really sees himself as this is his practice, this defines him in the world, and he's constantly learning. He's constantly picking up new clues and cues as to how he can do a better job the next time. I want that for every student would ever see, and you'll ever see. But as we've heard, do they come in that way, or have they lost it by the time they're through elementary school?
Dave, how many business people have you encountered, quote unquote? How many business people have you encountered who maintain that who have that sense,
the joy,
maintain that sense? I mean, isn't there something inherent to, I don't know, capitalism, the United States in 2020, whatever, that actively discourages that.
I'll leave the question up to you experts in observations. Jim, put your mute off, because Jim's just working on this right now. We had a podcast last week. And Sarah's question is there something deadening about way businesses overall are done that takes that craftsmanship away?
Sarah, I really liked your session, and you just brought up item number 10 of my list of items to talk about from this session. I've been sitting here and then run all the way from what does it mean to facilitate and leadership and purpose and all that stuff. But I'll try and answer your question as well as I can. I think we're in a broken system, and we have a systemic problem. And the businesses are run. We teach our students, and business accepts it, that the purpose of the firm is to maximize shareholder wealth. And it goes right smack down to the purpose of the firm. And that entraps everybody. And that makes everybody a means to an end. Customers are a means to an end. Managers are a means to an end. Employees, the environment. It's all about how we can maximize our profits. And it turns out that even if you're the most honorable, deeply committed, spiritual, fundamentally decent CEO, you can't keep your job if you have a dip in your profits. And so you've got to keep those profit shares up. Now, Michael Jensen, who has some faults and has accomplished some things we wish he hadn't accomplished, I did come up with a couple of good ideas, one of which is the concept of managerial cocaine. Have you come across that one?
No.
We know from Deming that we expect profits to rise and to float a bit. They'll have ups and downs from the shocks of the system, the natural variation. But the worst thing that can happen in many respects to a company is to have a really, really, really good quarter. or worse, a really, really good year. Because those come about by accident.
Yeah.
And those accidents are not repeatable. And so what you have to do when you have a good quarter or good year is you've got to then cut R&D, so you're going to have a good quarter next time, and you got to let people off, and you got to do one crazy destructive thing after another to keep artificially keeping profits higher than the natural variation. Even if it's rising, the natural variation allows. And so for me, there's a lot of issues come up here. One is, I liked, I'll go a little bit longer, but I could go on for 2 hours, this statement. I like your definition. Your definition was helpful to me because as you were starting it, I was grappling with calling versus process.
Yeah.
Now, I see the definition as nailing process pretty well. And it got me really thinking about what I do as facilitating. 3 years ago, no, the third time I did the doctoral program, facilitated, which every 3 years was just pure joy. Just loved doing it. But one of the speakers said, apparently had never seen a facilitator in action. He's a very pro-level academic, well-known. And he said, wow, I've never seen anything like this. If you write something about it, I'll read it. And all I was doing was what everybody does. I was just facilitating, nothing new, nothing fancy. And it got me thinking a little bit about it. I started hearing things that relate to this. I think the definition can help me maybe finally write that as I try to figure out what the hell are we doing, not just Jim Stoner, but all of us, when we facilitate and it works. But the thing that I'm struggling with, and I've been struggling with for about a decade, is we teach leadership. We teach the how of it. And we're starting to teach a little bit about the being of it. And we know that we're pretty transparent when we're trying to do something that's not consistent with who we are. And people see right through us and know we're phony.
That's a key.
We also know that if we try and do stuff that is who we are, we get good results. And so the being versus the doing thing is absolutely, I think, critical for leadership. Yes. But what I've been troubled by, and in that definition, it reminded me again, we don't talk about for what, why are we leading? And it seems to me it's really inappropriate for us to teach leading, which can be interpreted as influencing or managing other people like that without putting a stake in the ground that there's a morally correct right way or right things to lead for. And we shouldn't lead for bad stuff. And it's fundamentally wrong to do that. The last thing is business schools are teaching business as usual. And that's destroying the planet. And we're doing that. And so the stuff I'm involved in going forward, and right now in the last couple of years, is trying to transform what we do in business schools away from business as usual to managing for a sustainable, regenerating, flourishing, et cetera world, but managing for a world we can live in. And the exciting thing is I think it's doable. I think it's embarrassingly doable. I guess the last thing, I know I talked for a long time. Last fall, I found myself teaching. Dave's heard all this. I apologize, Dave.
Oh, no, it's all right.
Last fall, I found myself at the last minute teaching an undergraduate course in principles of management. And I said, I can't teach this stuff anymore. This way. And I always just, I didn't teach bad stuff, but I accepted the paradigm. I didn't rant and rave to the extent I could. So I threw the course out, and it was about teaching for sustainability and in a principles of management course, and about learning of that. And the last assignment, I'll go on forever. I'm amazed at how good my students are. These are undergraduate sophomores, but all of my students, once I sit down and listen to them, they are doing unbelievable stuff. They are amazing people. So this idea that we send graduates out that can't do stuff, it's not my experience. My experience is I can't believe these kids are so much better than I was and am right now.
But
and so the last assignment was to write, I won't give you the reason, but write a statement as to what your doctoral dissertation in sustainability would be, where you would do that dissertation, and with whom you would work.
And these are
part of a series of things they were doing. And what they wrote was really, really, not all of them, was really, really good. So those are my 10 items, about half of them.
But Jim has said something again that I'll re-invoke Peter on this, because that was really what he was as a teacher. For those of us who had him as a teacher, he honored us by listening, really listening. And how do we know he was listening? Because he would weave things that we said. Sometimes it sounded pretty simplistic when we said it, but he'd figure it out and he'd weave it in and he'd keep us moving forward. But he acknowledged our point of view. He wanted that point of view. And sometimes, as we've all done with exercises, he teed them up by putting up provocative questions or getting them involved in some kind of hands-on. But it was always so that the students could be heard. And that was the voice that he knew that they were going to have to use, we were going to have to use when we got the hell out of there. And so he would be loving what he's hearing, what I'm hearing for him today, because he would be hopeful. And he probably would say that there were some students who he never reached and who never was heard. Maybe they were introverts or didn't have the right modality to speak. But overall, he still was optimistic. But he said, I'm optimistic only if we can adjust what we teach, how we teach, when we teach, where we teach, to the extent that it's moving them along and accelerating their learning practice, as he called it, rather than stultifying it or making them doubtful that they are, could become supreme learners. One of the last words that Peter said, and we had this conversation, I said, Peter, okay, this is back to the why. What's the job then? What's the job? He said, every time they're in a course of ours, our one and only obligation is that they are better learners when they finish the class than when they started. And I said, well, yeah, we have learning objectives. We measure them now. He said, in so many words, he said, that's bullshit. That's not what I mean at all. Measured learning objectives. It's like someone telling you how to understand a poem by telling you the 5 things you should know and then prove it. He said, you'll know that the learning's better because you'll see it, you'll feel it, you'll hear it. And they'll come back to you later on and tell you the adventure they're having. So that's what I've dedicated this phase of my practice to, my teaching practice, is to have these conversations, which we only have a few minutes left to do. Record some of them, get them out to the world. With your help, maybe you'll spread them around a little bit. But it's in that and 10,000, 100,000 other efforts to crack the hold that certain very old ideas have held on business schools in particular. Crack them open, and I don't mean destroy them. I mean release. Let the kraken out. Let's get it out there. Let's have some of the joy. Sarah, I watched her office across the hall. I watched the kids coming out over the years. They never knew what they were going to be talking about when they knew generally what they're going to talk about in that class. But by the end of the day, their heads are like, whoa, and I'm thinking this and I'm thinking that. That's the kind of teaching that this conference is about as well. So final thoughts from anyone and everyone.
Yeah, just to be a little disruptive, since we won't really discuss it. I think it's a bad diagnosis to say the problem's capitalism, because capitalism is not one thing. It got way off track when Milton Friedman declared that the only business of business is to improve stockholders' profits. And that has a whole series of unforeseen consequences that we see playing out. That it's not easy to change that system is part of the complex society we live in. But in my experience, nonprofits, social organizations, and a whole bunch of others where there's no direct profitability involved make the same dumb mistakes, get carried away on the wrong things. The minute you get a bunch of people together, you have complexities of divergent interests that have to get reconciled. And that leads to a whole bunch of stuff, including unintended consequences from the systems and structures. So I have a problem narrowing it down to the problem is capitalism. It's the kind of capitalism we've had mostly embraced. And it's hard for small groups to do anything about it, because even if they build organizations that are different, they get swept up by people who've got more money, and that it wipes out some of the best practices. So that's my tiny little side soapbox.
The only reason I would respond is I would certainly agree with you, Alan, and I made that point this morning in my session that there's definitely no one capitalism. And I think my grandfather was a New England banker in the middle of the 20th century, and he would have been appalled at what capitalism has become. I mean, he was a diehard conservative Republican, but yes, so I think it's when we don't encourage thinking, again, back to sort of the point Dave was raising about what is, being present with what the actual circumstances are. And if we cling to some ideology that capitalism is, as some of my students would say, democracy, no, but paying attention to people's actual experience, what's actually going on, and then trying to think about how do we, produce and distribute goods and services and stuff. But it's when I think if we cling to some absolute version of any system, it blinds us to reality.
Yes, I think we're in
You all
violent
have read
agreement.
the article, The Struggle for the Soul of Business Schools, which I think is a good layout for, I don't use the word capitalism. I don't think I remember ever using it in class. I did find in Sapiens a little talk about capitalism I thought was really, really helpful. But the neoliberal narrative is, I think, what we're basically struggling against.
Well,
By the way, since you said it, Sarah, one of my pet angsts in this current time is the way in which ideology keeps people from being open even to hard data.
yeah.
And we're seeing it on the national stage all over the place. Drives me nuts.
Well, we've got a few minutes, and what I'd like to do spontaneously here is give Peter Vale the last word. So I'm going to jump up real quick to our podcast, and let's give him the last word. Here we go. I'm going to take you right up to the very last recording we had, and just randomly pick the last few minutes of Peter's thoughts on practice and see what comes up. Okay, here we go. I'll just put it on and jump right over to the middle.
Conversations with me personally.
Yeah.
That's an enormously gratifying thing to hear. Frankly, I've heard it several times in my career, and every time I've heard it, I have just glowed, because it's what I'm hoping for my effect to be on my learners and on my colleagues. I'm not just whistling Dixie.
No.
With these folks.
Not at all. In fact, you know what? I asked you once.
I'm going to take it back just a tad, because this really by coincidence is what we ended up with.
They avoid the learning that
as we go forward. I've known them, and
we're talking about my former students.
I have a deep affection for each of them. And why? In particular, because I know that they are results driven for sure, but not driven people. They love results. They set a much higher bar for themselves. And this is a pattern, I think, of all the ones we've talked with so far, than any corporate bar has been set for them.
Yes.
And they just keep raising that bar. So here's one quick thread that I thought of as we're reflecting on those conversations. In every case, including Meisel, who's
Steve Meisel,
paid to be a learner for his whole career, they're fiercely committed to learning.
Yeah.
They will not let something block or minimize or even certify their learning to the extent that it holds them to a certain point. They just want to keep going and growing. Did you pick up on that? think of Christina and
Yeah,
Jackie.
all of them. That so many times a person runs into something they don't understand, and so they back away from it, and they put it in the round file, or they somehow avoid the learning that this new technology or this new individual person or this new job opportunity, that they avoid the learning that it would promise. This goes back to one of my, as you know, one of my concerns about higher education is that we don't have, higher education does not have a way of thinking itself about learning that it can then begin to impart to students generally in all fields, so that students graduate as more effective learners than they were when they came in.
That's right.
They don't, in yours and my language in these podcasts, higher education does not succeed in imparting learning as a practice to students. They don't have learning as a practice. These individuals that you're talking about, that we've talked to, clearly have learning as a practice, and will, and the younger ones will deepen and thicken and enrich this practice as they go along, so that they will be 10 or 15 or 20 years from now, they will be really powerful learners, and they will therefore be qualified for jobs that require powerful learning abilities.
Yes.
And
So I'm glad I selected that, because it was the last 5 minutes or so Peter and I had the benefit of this conversation, and there it was, that higher education has to figure out how to develop with students a practice of learning. And he deeply believed in that, and so do I, and I think all of us do here. So that's a big challenge. How do we get them to be more confident, more able, more facile, and picking up on the clues and cues of what's going on in their immediate context, and integrating those into a point of view, and then filling in the gaps and moving forward. In other words, back to the beginning, how to learn through uncertainty and strengthen their practice for the long haul. So thank you, folks.